Hi, you're listening to Beyond Profits, a podcast by 117 Capital, where we explore the principles, ethics, and impact behind truly sustainable business. In a world driven by profit margins, we are shifting the conversation, diving into value-based leadership, non-interest finance, and the evolving role of ethical investing. Rooted in the spirit of Islamic finance, Beyond Profits is where ethics meets finance, where purpose meets performance, and where values drive ventures. Each episode, we engage with leading voices across various industries, discussing how non-interest finance principles and frameworks are reshaping sustainable business growth, empowering communities, and redefining wealth. Whether you are an entrepreneur, investor, or future leader, this space is for you. Because at 117 Capital, we believe that profits is just the beginning. The true measure of success lies in what we build beyond profits.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Profits, a 117 podcast. I remain your host, Imran Musa, and today we'll be talking about a topic that hits home ownership for Nigerians. With the way that prices are soaring up and then inflation is catching up with individuals and stagnant wages, it becomes more difficult for individuals to own homes in today's current era. So this is a topic which, we have to discuss, we have to dissect, and we need to see, is it really possible for this generation coming up to own homes the way our parents did? And together with me is no other person than Abdulkadir. He is the General Manager for Business and Strategy at Bilaad Realty, and we will be dissecting this topic with him. Welcome on board, and it's a pleasure to have you, Abdulkadir.
Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure being here as well.
So I'll dive in straight.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to know if we're on the same page. Do you agree that there's a decline in terms of home ownership for the average Nigerian today?
Of course, certainly. There is a significant decline, and it goes beyond what we're able to see. The challenges are not what they used to be. They have evolved, and we're still the same. So there is a significant myriad of problems that we're going through in terms of home ownership, capacity to offtake. The interest remains there. In fact, it's increasing because the deficit is increasing by the day. However, the challenge we have is the economic factors and really not going in favor of people interested in buying. So yes, there is a significant challenge in that area.
So the next question will now be, will members of this generation ever be able to own homes, average members of this generation?
Well, that's a very tricky question because you see, the ability to purchase a home is usually a very dynamic factor. What we used to know as home ownership options or home ownership directives are no longer what they are today because the deciding factors are slightly different. The economic climate is completely different. Individual purchasing differences are different. And equally, the client satisfaction metrics that are being used for individuals to be attracted to buying homes have completely shifted. So you see, in your opening statement, you equally mentioned the comparison between how our parents used to buy homes versus how we can buy as of today and even the future generation. Obviously, it's not the same. It's completely different. However, is it still possible for our generation or the generation ahead of us to be able to buy homes? Yes, it is. But what would it take? Obviously, it's going to take a lot of innovation. It's going to take a lot of changes. We cannot continue using the same methodology that we assumed or we grew up to meet to be able to meet up with those demands of today. So yes, it's possible, but then it requires a little bit more effort and a little bit more innovation into the system, generally speaking.
Yes, so you mentioned that the climate has changed, the factors that determine home ownership have changed.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody knows in their head that something has changed, but not everybody can pinpoint what changed. So if you can run us through, what do you think has changed that makes the home ownership dynamics different?
Okay, so you see, we can start with individualistic differences, right? As individuals, the client buying criteria are no longer the same as what they used to be. Back in the days in our parents' time, people were just looking for basically four walls and a roof. That's basically what they were looking for. Shelter, right? But then you see, with time, innovation, technology, and all of that, the demands of homeowners have slightly changed. It's no
True.
longer just having four walls and a roof.
True.
People want electricity. Back then, it used to be a luxury before. People want internet connection, because right now in this modern age, you cannot even survive as a human being without some of these amenities. They are no longer luxury, but they are now necessities. They are primary amenities that are required to survive, right? Pipe-borne water, Internet of Things, basically having convenience, safety, and all of that.
Yeah.
The security challenges that we're faced with right now in our current environment demand some innovative measures to be able to survive within our environment. So those type of things are now things that are no longer just luxurious, even down to issues of safety and living lifestyle around the homes that we have. So ultimately, the client buying criteria are completely different. So even the type of properties that are going to be available, you'll find out that some available property, the indexes that we have right now, are becoming very obsolete. So even people who can afford it are no longer interested in buying, right? So because you need new inventory to come into play. That is on the one hand. On the second hand, you now have economic factors. Back in the days where we have a stronger economy, wherein the purchasing power is there, the standard of living is much more better, the basic supporting factors of government to be able to, afford the purchase of these houses. Because one thing that is very critical for us to be able to appreciate is that housing globally cannot be done by an individual. Generally speaking, you cannot achieve housing on a large scale on an individualistic basis, right? So there has to be a social component to it. And who is the basic provider of social services? It's the government. So there has to be infrastructure surrounding aid for individuals to be able to purchase some of these houses. Now, one thing that is now prevalent in our current environment is that the demand has grown so high over and beyond what the current foresight of the government is able to partake. So to a large extent, there is now a significant gap in what the government can now do versus what the general public basically requires. So as much as the gap is still being, met to some certain degree, on a larger scale, there's a significant deficit that exists there, because what the government is able to do is quite marginal compared to what is actually being required. Then lastly, we now come to the intent of individuals within the space that are able to make it happen, both in the public and the private sector. Now, the intent of individuals have largely changed. From a business perspective, yes, it's profit-oriented, and then people are a little bit more greedy right now, rather than the way it used to be before, where you have even private sector individuals that are looking out to making a difference in the environment, knowing that at least to a large extent, even if I don't make that much money, I can say I supported in XYZ. Then you have the people within the government space as well. The thinking capacity of individuals that we have in those particular spaces are largely limited, primarily perhaps by virtue of the type of system that we run versus the time that we live in. So the type of system that we run as government today does not align with the type of environment that we live in, because the environment has changed while the government is still the same as it used to be even way back then. So those are three primary reasons that one can look at and say they are a significant factor that basically determines whether or not housing purchase can be easier or otherwise. So to a large extent, once we're able to pinpoint all of these three things and then look at those criteria surrounding these three things, we can now start to dwell on how do we address or how do we approach those type of concerns, generally speaking.
True. There is something that I have noticed with the generation, and I don't know if it is due to the fact that it's harder to own homes, but currently I speak to a lot of young people, 35 and below, or even 40 and below, and some of them, they tell you, I mustn't own a home, right? I wouldn't kill myself to own a home. Like, they tell you, even if I have the money, or they don't have it, but even if I have it, I will not buy a house, because if I have that money now, I invest it and do this and do this and do this. And instead of just owning a home, like if I'm to pay rent for the next 20 years, it might not even cost the amount of a home. So it's not even a good financial decision. So now I'm asking you, this analogy or this ideology rather, does it make sense? Right? Because if somebody is paying rent of maybe 2 million or 3 million every year, and he does that for 20 years, he adds up to about 60 million. An average comfortable house of the type that he's living in, doesn't cost 60 million. So why should he own a home?
So here's the thing. You see, just like I've said, times have changed. The client buying criteria are slightly different right now. The entrepreneurial spirit that we used to have back then is no longer the same as today, because the world is moving in a very fast-paced way, right? And our generation are largely looking way ahead of our lifetime to a large extent. So what you end up finding out is individuals of today that are interested or they are looking forward to buying a home, which are people within our own clients, within our own generation, or people even younger, are looking at things from a different perspective, largely speaking. Now, it depends on at what level of life one is that would determine what the right answer would be, because that question is a very subjective one, right? It depends on where you are in life, generally speaking. Now, people nowadays, you find out that young people, as of today, will tell you, yes, as much as I wouldn't want to own a home, or I don't need to own a home, maybe not want, but not need. They don't need to kill themselves, just like you said, right? They still feel the want to own it because, one, there's a sense of pride it has, right? Because it's a sentimental reason. There's a sentimental attachment to owning one to a large extent, except someone who has not thought to that extent yet, right? And it's a factor of where you are in life, generally speaking, right? Now, the second thing is the decision as to whether if I eventually own one, should I live in it or not? Right? So that's another criteria that one has to consider. So sometimes you speak to young individuals as of today and they tell you they don't feel the need to own a home, may not necessarily mean they don't think it's important, but rather the perspective to which they're thinking is of the fact that as of today, we have business ventures that allow you own a home and also rent one, right? So you own one, or you rent it out to someone, then you rent one and you still net off a difference that gives you additional income to a large extent. So that is the perspective to which individuals are thinking nowadays. Because back then, a couple of decades ago, the opportunities of making a living are much more available than today. We live in a highly competitive environment of which if you are not quite innovative enough, you would hardly survive. So to a large extent, people are thinking completely outside the box. Back then, the whole intent is, I'd like to grow up, I'll get a family, I'll own a home, I'll get old, my children will grow up, then the cycle repeats itself over and over and over again. But right now it's becoming more and more difficult to be able to keep that cycle going over again because times will change. So the approach will have to change with it, right? So owning a home right now for someone is, I'm sitting down on a capital that could continue to turn around a means of living for me. Because at the end of the day, the means of living that is obtainable out there, only a handful of them can actually sustain the type of lifestyle that is obtainable that would be regarded as comfortable as at today.
True.
So to a large extent, it needs some level of innovation and some level of, risk-taking in terms of the approach towards living that type of comfortable life that does not become a menace in the environment. So the decision as to whether it's important to own a home or not, obviously owning a home is critical. It's critical to every individual. But what you choose to do with it is subjective. It's subjective to where you are in life and what you are foreseeing for yourself to a large extent.
Yeah, I agree. The way you mentioned the part of people owning homes but living in rented apartments, it's one thing I can relate to with a lot of individuals that I know. And people would wonder why, but like you mentioned, at the end of the day, they net off a difference.
Exactly.
and it balances out for them. So still on this concept of, now I'm going to dive, I wanted to leave solutions till the end of it, but I'll dive into it partly because we spoke about renting. So there's this concept of rent to own, right? Rent to own. So I'm renting and I'm buying the property at the same time. Do you think that in today's era, it is one of the possible solutions that could aid in making home ownership easier? And if yes, how do we go about it?
Now, I think confidently say it's perhaps one of the only options that we have as of today. Because just like I said, globally, there is no requirement for there's no way for an individual to be able to own a home globally, everywhere in the world, no matter how good the economy is, no matter how good your source of earning is. If you want a good home in a good environment, close to where you work, etc., it is very, very difficult. It's close to being impossible. Only a very minor sect of the individuals are able to actually buy that. Now, the only way to do that is through social intervention from government and the likes of it. However, like I said, this used to be the old model of doing things. But because we're moving into newer clients, newer environments, innovative ideas are coming up, it means there needs to be some level of flexibility for individuals to be able to own a home. And one of those options are a rent-to-home approach, which means you're buying the home without actually feeling like you're buying it, because you're still paying rent. You're basically paying rent with a bit of a markup on it in order to secure the home after a number of years. Pretty much similar to a mortgage. The only difference is that you start to benefit from the home even earlier on without having to complete paying for it. Right? So yes, is it one of the models that we could adopt to addressing this concern? Certainly. And how do we go about it? Obviously, there are several models that are obtainable in the market right now, conventionally and non-conventionally, right? So Sharia compliant and the conventional models. However, partly the challenge that we tend to have is now the ability to have those type of patient funds that are able to wait out that period. Because at the end of the day, rent-to-own models are long-term investments
because I was about to say it's very capital intensive.
Of course, it's capital intensive.
Long-term
and
as well.
It's long-term oriented. Now, how many people or how many institutions do we have that have those type of liquidity lying around for that long-term purpose? Now, long-term purpose is obtainable. However, long-term here meaning 20, 30 years, because the maximum that is obtainable right now out there is maybe between 5 to 7 years, which is still very stringent for individuals that are looking to buy a home. How much is an average earner? Somebody who has a very good earning, right? How much is it compared to the price of the house? By the time you factor the cost of the fund and all of that, it now becomes practically impossible to achieve within a period of 7 years. So it's still going to be very stringent. So the ability for us to be able to pull resources, pull funds in a manner that will now take that long period. And why do you think that is happening? From our perspective in the development industry is that the challenge we're riddled with is inflation. So even the financials are afraid of keeping their fund for that long, because there is no guarantee that the annual rental fee that you're going to be charging can actually match the inflationary rates that we're working with. So you would end up as an institution losing resources if you're following that model, right? However, this is now where hybridization will come in play, bridging finance will come in play from several means, and bridging them together to be able to have a much more seamless approach and a much more manageable cost for the off-taker at the end of the day. Now, there are several initiatives that have come up. Yes, none of them has really catalyzed yet, but we're hoping that they will be able to come mainstream in the very near future, all things being equal.
Inshallah. It is. I think I was speaking to one of my colleagues about a company called Way Home in the UK, and they do this rent-to-own model. You just need to buy a minimum of just 5% of the house, and then you pay rent on 95, and gradually you graduate, you pay off. And then the good thing about it again was that when you come and say, I'm not doing again, I've bought 30%, I can't afford it again. You can now, they can either buy it off, or then you look for a secondary buyer that buys and continues. So the only thing the only concern we had, or we were able to identify, aside from the funding itself, looking for the funds, was now the concept of the part of uncertainties in terms of income, because a certain house needs to be owned by a person with a certain amount of income.
Yep.
And that part where you spoke about the taste now comes in. Because a person who earns like below $1 million might want a house that is, if you show him the house that,
certainly,
then he's like,
of course,
no, I don't want this. He wants more.
It comes back to those criteria that I
Yes.
mentioned, the buying criteria.
He wants more.
Yes.
And even for the person who can afford to buy more, to buy somebody with a higher purchasing power, basically, it also comes with the issue of, the instability in economy. Because, when after a year or two, there's a high chance that in the area that person is living in, rent might double, but income doesn't double.
It doesn't.
So it now comes to the question of how can this person keep up with not only the rent, but also now, because now the house value also goes up. So how can he now continue buying? So a lot of things we identified that is different from where we saw it and our own climb. So the question is, how do we go forward now?
So you see,
because I want to buy a house.
You see, now what you just mentioned, these are primary concerns that goes beyond what a private sector or a public sector will do individually. It's a concern that requires all parties to be on the same deck for them to be able to address. Now, what am I referring to? What is the underlying reason why a model that operates there and seamlessly working can no longer work here? It's that instability that we have. The instability is tied to the economic conditions surrounding it, because it's tied to the strength of the currency that you're operating. Now, just imagine if you were to implement that same model here in Nigeria, and you're saying you're hedging your prices with the USD. It'll work for the business owner. For the business owner, seamlessly, no issue, no concern.
Yeah.
Because you're benchmarking it with a much more stable currency to a large extent, which means the value of what you have anticipated will still remain what you get even the next 10 years, right? Arguably.
Yes.
Right? However, it doesn't favor the off-taker because it becomes that challenge of affordability. Eventually, that off-taker will no longer be able to afford it, because the way the value will keep diminishing, it doesn't imply in the earnings, because the earnings are in a currency that is not very stable. So that now becomes a challenge. Now, how do we address this? The simplest way, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to it, right? So it's going to be on an individualistic basis. Now, we all understand that it is very, very typical of a Nigerian to have multiple income streams, right? Hardly you find an individual in Nigeria that survives on one income,
yes.
Right? It's almost impossible. Why? Because the opportunities are immense. The value of what it is that you are making cannot really sustain you over a long period of time, because things will change. We all go to the same market. Things change every day. You go today, you find a particular value. You go tomorrow, you see a different thing. But then where you're coming from, you still make the same money, right?
Yes.
So you constantly need to be a bit creative. You have to be creative all the time to be able to source for additional income. Now, in that sense, it means we will no longer be dependent on the conventional means of doing, vettings of individuals, right? It means financial institutions or even private sector organizations will have to be going deeper into the means of individuals to be able to structure transactions individually, rather than doing a one-size-fits-all that only a sector or only a sect of the majority can be able to apply. So what does that mean? It means there needs to be an open platform that basically looks at, because we're going into an era of artificial intelligence, right? Right? So those things have to be put in place. And those are technologies that can be leveraged on trends. Trends can be looked at. Once an individual is able to indicate the various source of incomes that they have, you can basically project. You can basically forecast what they can afford based on the past history that they have. Now, the challenge that would come about that is the ability to be honest, the sincerity of purpose of why you intend to even do that, right? Because ultimately what will end up happening is that the opportunity will now be riddled by individuals who just want to make money, right? Because it's going to be an opportunity for every individual to be able to own a home. But then you find out that because I have the capacity to take it right now, I'll take it just so that I can mark up for somebody who doesn't have the capacity today, which means I'm blocking an opportunity for someone else.
Somebody.
So all through, it is going to be a holistic solution to be done from a holistic perspective. It cannot be done from only a private sector perspective or a government perspective or a public perspective, right? Largely because there needs to be a uniformity in how these records are kept. Now, the database that we have, national databases we have, are not so consolidated. And that is the only way to be able to ensure that individuals that are requiring these transactions are actually able to access these transactions, this type of opportunities. Otherwise, it will just be one of those products, again, that keeps coming up, and only a certain number of individuals are able to benefit from it, largely. Meanwhile, the larger populace are still finding it difficult. Another perspective to look at is looking at a completely different perspective of development. Housing is a very dynamic structure. It's a very dynamic solution. It's a very dynamic factor that doesn't have to be one way. Unfortunately, in our environment, it's only one way it has to be done. It has to be built through brick and mortar, right? The ability for people to adapt to alternative building technologies is not so attractive.
What are alternative building technologies? Because it's only brick and mortar, me too, I know.
Exactly. Now, yes, you do know it, but then you've seen perhaps there's wood, there's PVC, there's polystyrene, there are several materials. There is hydrofoam blocks, that's mud, basically, but it's just the advanced mud, right? Because it's pretty much burnt, so it's quite treated and it's much stronger. However, the challenge we tend to have is acceptability, right? Because even for you as an individual, you said you've only heard of brick and mortar. If I tell you I've built a house with wood, would you go into it?
You see, if rain fall now, it will just fall.
Exactly, right? But they are tested and trusted methodologies that exist globally. But then the ability for people to be able to accept it is equally a challenge. And how do we do that? Again, it has to be with government intervention, because public buildings needs to start adopting that. Once we're starting to have public buildings in that climate, then individuals will start to go, it means it's not too bad. It means
Just
we can adopt it.
Just the way somebody said, until all the government officials change their cars to CNG.
Exactly.
That's when he will go and change his own.
So basically, change is a factor of the driver. If the driver doesn't change, nobody will agree to change. Right? So if the driver of any innovative idea that is expected to go on a mass production does not adopt it, does not accept it, it makes it practically impossible for any individual or any private sector entity to be able to drive it. Right? So that's the basic concept behind it to a large extent.
Yes, and one day I was just like, everybody should just stop thinking, just go and build the type of olden days house and just put small things inside and go and live. Because if you look at it, when we take it like average earners, because even when we come up with a lot of, home owning solutions, I feel like the people who would get a benefit will be maybe those in like upper middle class.
Certainly.
Because now upper middle class,
they're almost non-existent, by the way.
Yes, that gap keeps, they used to exist, but it keeps they keep falling.
Yep.
So when you look at how much are average earnings, how much salaries, I saw something, and I don't know if the data is correct, but it was saying that only 2% of people earn above 500,000.
Yep.
And I was like so if 2% of people, I just looked at one of my sisters that's earning more than, I said, 1%. You're top 1%.
Top 1%.
So that concern, even when we get alternative models, I feel like there's also a need for individuals to understand realities and see how we can adopt simpler homes, functional homes, but simpler homes, so that, people can get to own houses. I own a house, it's simpler, it's not in Maitama, it's somewhere in, I don't know, if I'll call one area that the person will say his area is not, so some other area. people, I think expectations as well would make
so that
home
goes a
ownership.
very long way in terms of addressing this concern, because you see, back in the days, in the earlier, years of Nigeria being independent, where it starts to do things for itself and all of that, housing schemes were done for the citizens. And the perception of that type of housing scheme is still what is riddling in our head. So both people who are expecting to get housing schemes done by government, and both the government that is willing to do the housing schemes for them, the mindset is still not changed. And what you just said is very, very critical, that the adoption of even the type of housing needs to change. Because what used to be back then, really, during the independence, what was the population of Nigeria? What were the opportunities prevalent? We were booming. We had a booming economy. There was excess liquidity. We were doing excellently well. And the number of people that needs to be serviced are much lower, right? They're much smaller. So at that time, those were when we grew up and we found housing, housing schemes that were done for our parents, federal housing schemes, low cost housing
Low
rather,
cost, yes.
and all of that. Low cost housing today is a luxury house. Go to any state you go to, all the areas that are regarded as low cost have now become one of those areas that are prime.
When I was in Sokoto, say, when you speak of areas like we're in school and people say, where do you live? We were low cost, and then it's like those are you're living in the prime areas, and I'm like,
prime areas at that, but at that time those were the affordable housing, housing for the masses. That's what they regard as housing for the masses, right? But then unfortunately we allowed the demand to go much higher than the supply. So to a large extent, the supply is no longer able to service the demand, which means the quality of what the supply is going to get must be reduced. The standard of which the supply is expecting must be reduced in order for it to survive. Because what the demand is able to even do right now is not up to what it can do before. And what the supply is requesting for is much more than what the supply was asking for before. So we are completely having an inverse situation here, which means even for government to be able to drive it home, the alternative building technologies for social housing that should be considered, it needs to be driven from awareness perspective first before it's even implemented, because you will implement it and it becomes a ghost town. I'll give you a typical example. There's a housing project I visited in Kubwa. It was done by a private individual, and they used PVC and concrete structures to develop that particular estate. Excellently built, very beautiful, very nice, and they are expected to be cheaper. Generally, they imported most of those materials, right? Generally. Today, that place is a ghost town. There's just rats and lizards that are living in those houses, because people kept saying, "No, how would I go and stay in a plastic house?" Because they felt it's plastic. It's PVC, right? I mean, it's fitted with concrete in between and all of that, but the insulation is not that thick. And basically, they were built, and it has been standing there for about maybe 7 years right now. It's there. Nothing has happened to it. It has not gone down. It has not depreciated in terms of the standard and the quality of it. It is still there, but people are still telling you, no, you can't stay in a place like that. And look at the materials that he has imported. They're all there. Because he had to suspend the construction because the acceptability was not there in the first place. Now, people will have to equally start to appreciate the fact that there are multiple ways of living in a house. If we look at our brothers and sisters that live in the bushes, that live in shanties, even inside Abuja here, that is shelter at the end of the day. It's just that it's not organized. But the people live in tents.
Yes.
They build tents, and especially the nomads that move around, they live in tents. And basically their entire livelihood is inside those tents. They just tend to decouple it, move it along, get to another greener pasture, they set it up, and they live there. And they still have a good sense of living in their own perspective, right? So even in the areas of housing schemes that government will have to do, eventually government will have to understand and equally present those type of awareness programs for individuals that would be the beneficiaries of those housing schemes, that it will no longer be business as usual. And that's why today government is no longer able to do housing schemes that it used to do before. because the cost of housing using those same methodologies and technologies that were used back then is no longer tenable for the type of housing that you want to do. Because as at today, really, how much is a typical civil servant earning? Even at the level of a director.
The director.
It's nothing to write home about. So at the end of the day, it's not even sufficient to buy an affordable alternative building technology home. It can't even afford it, which means it has to be a social service that government will have to do. However, social service, if you are doing it with brick and mortar, the way we used to do low-cost housing, is now a premium house. So you can build those houses, but you won't be able to get a civil servant that can afford it, which means if it is based on their salary scheme, they won't be able to afford it. And that's why till today, government is finding it difficult to build houses for people, because by the time they look at the salary scheme and project retirement periods for all existing civil servants, there's no civil servant that can afford it. So what's the point of going into it? It becomes a lost cause even before you start it. So there needs to be that understanding and a significant level of awareness that needs to be driven by government, which is why we're discussing conversations surrounding public buildings to start adopting those. It doesn't have to be the entire building. It could be sectional, just some sections to be done. I think there was a governor in...
Do you know why I'm laughing before you continue?
Yes.
You know, I don't know. There's this real estate marketer that approached me, and he was telling me, I can't remember the brand, and he was just telling me, come and this. I said, so what makes your company different? He said, no, we want to ensure that every Nigerian owns a home. And now, so now when we just spoke about this, I'm like,
Well, the truth of the matter is we have to face the reality the way it is, you know. From a business and marketing perspective, obviously you would want to say something that is significantly optimistic. But then in the real sense of it, we all know what is behind the curtain. Is it really for every single Nigerian in Nigeria? Really, it is not. In the approach that we're taking as of today, which means individuals would have to take bold decisions, organizations would have to take bold steps in terms of driving some of these initiatives in order for us to be able to make it doable. Otherwise, we will continue to only service the upper middle that really no longer exists again, and the high income earners at the end of the day, leaving and creating larger vacuums for the lower middle and the lower income earners at the end of the day. So there has to be that bridge that comes in between for us to be able to drive this thing home ultimately.
True. Someone once mentioned something about if you want to sell something, you should just pick one class and focus on them. So he said, either go and look for the low class people, find a solution and sell, or find the rich people, find a solution and sell. But when you try to be in between, you get caught up in a lot of somebody who's building, duplexes and that are 300, 400, 500 million. He knows who's going to buy this. He focuses on it. 100 million Nigerians don't own a home. It's not his business. As long as my 10 units, 12 units will sell out, that's all. So I was now thinking, if a person comes up and says, okay, I want to focus on these low income houses, first of all, they will now need it there to an extent, even for the individual who has that idea, would have to come up with marketing strategy before he even built it. Marketing strategies that makes that, acceptable. That makes it acceptable to the individual, makes it, okay, this is nice. I think a lot of people see these container houses today and are like, makes sense. And that's how shops today, if you go to, everybody has adopted the container model instead of, so same thing, moving into houses. I'm not sure that there is any average Nigerian today, if it's going to be affordable, that you tell, okay, look, I have this nice 40 feet container space for an amount that he can afford, that he will say, no, I don't want to live in a container. Because now on our feeds on Instagram and everywhere, we're seeing it, even not in Nigeria, but we're seeing a lot of how the container houses work. So if someone is going to come up with something that works that way for them as well, they'll need to, even before he brings anything into the country, We need to pump out a lot of marketing that makes that seem like the future.
The future, and that's where everybody should head out to.
So that is
so that's basically where I was headed when I mentioned the awareness need to be created, which means you need to make it as attractive as possible. People to be interested and intrigued about it. So even the people that are not necessarily looking for affordable will be like, I'd like to be there, right? Because I want to be a part of it, right? It's the same thing that happens with electric vehicles right now. Right.
But there should not be one to be there, because it will now change dynamic and it will become expensive.
Of course. Now, here's the thing. The beauty of the market is that you really have limitations to how much you can control it, right? There's a limitation to how much you can control it. However, you can control how it goes out, right? But how people adapt to it is something that it's a riddle. Right? For every business, it's usually a riddle because you can only project and forecast, but then you really don't know how the market will react. Because while you're thinking of one way, someone is thinking of 10 other ways that they can make money from the one way, right? So people will always take advantage as opportunities prevail, especially again, with the current generation that we're in and the generation that is coming up. They're thinking much faster than we used to. So you are thinking of one solution for one problem. They're thinking of 10 solutions for 10 problems, right? From that same solution that you think is just for one, right? So that's the same way we have to continue to evolve and develop mechanisms that will be able to adapt. So the beauty of it is that we constantly need to remain agile. Agile in the sense that we are very, very nimble and we are not fixated on one way, and ensuring that we constantly remain with the trend, move with the market, move with the demand. Because once you remain the same for a long period of time, you will get phased out and you won't even realize it. You will just realize you're no longer in vogue, nobody's talking about you, you're no longer able to project into the market and all of that. Now, ultimately, building technologies there are a number of them. Containers that you just mentioned is one of them. The ability for people to be able to do it equally, education needs to be put in place because obviously the expertise need to be learned. We're used to building brick and mortar. Doesn't mean we can build wood. Doesn't mean we can do PVC. Doesn't mean we can do containers, right? The specialty needs to be brought in place. One of the things that we're riddled with in our industry is the fact that because I feel like I'm a developer and I build houses, I can actually leverage on any type of technology. We've had them plenty of them. Right? We've had plenty of them trying out multiple models that end up failing. And because of those failures, it reduces the ability for individuals to accept a new one when we come up with it. Because they feel like, no, didn't you see what happened there? They tried it and it didn't work. And it wasn't as though the technology was bad. It was the implementer of technology that was not that good. So there is equally that. So awareness is now on both sides, both on the side of people that are going to buy and both on the side of people that are going to implement. So there has to be that well-rounded perspective. The critical thing within our industry, unfortunately, is regulation that doesn't exist, right? It's practically non-existent. Only a very marginal portion of it is regulated. And now, because of that, every individual that feels the need or feels like they understand how money moves from one point to the next point and I can make a buck or two in between will tell you I'm a real estate developer, right? There is nobody that is checking the computers, the certifications, the licenses, their ability, their capacity. Nobody is there. And you as an individual, all you see is you go to the traffic light and you see people sharing flyers and everything. And you pick them up because at the end of the day, that's all you have. That's all you have to go through. You pick them and you pray to God that the one I'm choosing will be the right one. And you go and put your money with the hope that you will prevail. If it fails, you really don't have anybody to report to. If it succeeds, you're the happiest man in this life, right? So it's like a fluke. The whole idea of real estate, unfortunately, in our environment is that it's under-regulated, which now makes it almost impossible for anybody to go in with that much confidence of success. And that is one thing that happens in the global picture, because every single place you go to that has, a coordinator system guided by regulation and government, you realize that they are developing much more seamlessly rather than our type of environment to a large extent.
True. So my next question will be, we've identified these problems. They say business is providing solutions for a problem. Now we've identified this problem that is not yet, people are looking for solutions, but we've not really been able to come up with a proper solution framework. Is your company going to take the head start in ensuring that, okay, in the next 5-6 years, I'll buy a house? I don't know for other people. But are you providing a solution? Are you looking to take that leadership position? Your company obviously is already in a leadership position in the real estate space. Are you willing to now push further, take that leadership mantle to say, okay, for the average Nigerian, we are looking to craft a solution for you so that you are able to own a home in the nearest future?
So I would say yes, but yes in the future, not today. In the existence of Bilaad Realty from when we started, it had never been focused on affordable housing, largely because we have understudied the market as much as we could. I wouldn't say well enough, but as much as we could. And the one thing that we've come to realize is you really cannot dwell into affordable housing without premium housing, because you have to leverage on the high income earners and the upper middle income earners to make some money that you can subsidize for the low income earners and the lower middle income earners, which means one cannot survive without the other. Right? Now, what are we looking at in this perspective? We've been in existence for the last little over 7 years right now. And our focus have been on the premium and the luxury side of development, largely because we're trying to build a strong backbone in order for us to be able to look outwards into the affordable housing. Are we there yet? No, we're not. The reason behind it is that, just like I've mentioned earlier on, affordable housing is not a small feat. It's not something that can be done by an individual or a private entity on its own or for a public entity on their own. It has to be a combined energy. Now, in order for us to be able to do that, largely when it comes to affordable housing, you're talking about mass development, because again, it is largely impossible to be done in small chunks. It has to be on a mass development if you even want it to make anything close to making sense.
Yes.
Right? It has to be on a large scale. Now, we're able to secure funding, because funding is a critical component, is a critical driver for. Now, funding is also another critical component, because again, not so strong. It's not so strong, right? Largely because cost of funding is high, inflationary rates are high, and that's why the cost of funding then feel obligations towards either repayment or even access is equally a challenge, right? Because of the instability that we have, either from the market or from the off-takers that we have, right? So there are significant challenges surrounding funding to a large extent. Now, what are we doing in that perspective? Our idea was build from a premium and luxury perspective, so much so that you are able to build a strong enough capital base. Once you have a strong enough capital base doesn't have to be liquid. It could be asset based. Once you're able to have that, it means you now have a backbone that you can either use that capital or use the asset that you've gathered thus far to be able to source for that type of funding that you can now leverage on mass development. It could either be through guarantees from government entities. That's now where the relationship with government entities will come in, such that government no longer have to do housing scheme for civil servants. They can leverage the ability of a private sector individual that has the capacity, the wherewithal, and the development initiative to be able to build on that particular perspective, while the government provides a guarantee that we will push our own people to come and offtake from it, while we guarantee your source of income is coming. Now, the only way for us to be able to do that is to ensure that we're able to have that capital base that can cushion the effect for a longer period, because this government cannot do it at a go. So, yes, to your question of whether Bilaad is looking into going into affordable development, but not as at today. As of today, our focus is still within the premium and the luxury development. There is a segment that we've created which is in between the premium and the affordable, which is called the mid-premium. So it gives you some level
I was
of...
about to smile, but I had premium inside.
Yes, it's still premium. It's still premium, largely because we understand that, again, just like you said, you met a marketer earlier on, and they mentioned they are building for every single Nigerian. You understand that the developments that most developers have are not meant for every single Nigerian. It's only meant for a few, a very, very few. No matter how cheap you think a developer's house is meant for a very, very few. Right? So to a large extent, we don't want to be oblivious of calling our homes affordable. They're not. We know. We understand that. As much as we have houses that are as low as 40, 50 million, they cannot be regarded as affordable. Because again, affordability is subjective. Right? Because what one may regard as affordable because you have 50 million is probably because you're sitting on 200. Meanwhile, someone who's sitting on only 1 million in a year will tell you 40 million. We want to send you back to the village, right? So those are things that are quite subjective. So yes, we're working towards getting into that perspective where we're able to have those type of relationships and developments in that light. But as of today, our primary focus is within the mid-premium, premium, and more on the luxury perspective, but not on that.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdulkadir, and we hope that, like you've mentioned, where Bilaad is heading on a long-term basis, and we hope that also the government, other players, everybody just comes on board to make things easier for the average Nigerian to be able to live, own homes, yes, to be able to live. And it was a very insightful discussion, one very, very interesting one, and we definitely hope to have you again on Beyond Profits for other conversations. So I urge the subscribers to like, share, subscribe, share to your friends, follow us on all our social media platforms at One17 Podcast, and keep looking beyond profits till we meet again. Bye.